Hello and welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. It is week 2 in our year-long series, 50 Weeks That Shaped America, a collection of stories that we think helped bring us to this moment in U.S. history, as the country marks 250 years, which is the semi-quincentennial. Semi-quincentennial is kind of a hard word to say. It's even harder to say if you've had a few, which won't be an issue because this week we are headed to 1920 and the start of Prohibition. The 18th Amendment had been ratified 1 year earlier, and on January 16th of 1920, it all went into effect. Close up the bars, dump out the booze, or maybe hide the booze in a back room. We will get into that. We'll also get into why we think Prohibition was one of the 50 stories that helped shape this country. But suffice it to say, this story is a very American blend of social and cultural and political movements, mixed with a dash of corruption, shaken by law enforcement and poured over the rocks that are... I can't even finish this metaphor. I'm just going to bail on it right here. But I tried.
Yeah, pretty far.
I tried. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
We've talked on this show about the melting pot and the stew, but has anyone compared the American experience to like a shaken or stirred cocktail?
No, and I think it's time we start to change that.
Okay. Well, maybe we will.
A dash of bitters.
Yeah. So, look, we're going to get into the deep roots of Prohibition and how these kind of confluence of social and political movements led to this moment. I did point out that January 16th of 1919 is when the 18th Amendment is ratified. There's basically a year to prepare for January 16th, 1920. I want to read a quote from the Sacramento Star describing the scenes on January 16th, the day this goes into effect. But it basically says, constitutional prohibition, the dream of reformers for more than a century, becomes a reality at a minute after midnight tonight in every nook and corner of the U.S. and its possessions. And Kellie, no surprise, it was sort of chaos.
It's chaos. I mean, the only thing I can sort of equate it to is like a Black Friday sort of situation in which like people are like going crazy for the latest, I don't know, toy that everybody wants. But you had to get your booze in as fast as you possibly could before the law changed. And so stores are like setting out boxes and boxes of liquor, like $1 a bottle, you know, like everyone is trying to scramble. There are a frenzy of cars lined up everywhere, people with trucks, wagons, whatever you can get, whatever form of transportation you can get to carry as much booze as you possibly can is what is happening. And it's a mad dash. And yeah, it's chaos because essentially once the law goes into effect, the federal government has hired 1,400 special prohibition agents to go after people who are in violation of the law. And they have sort of weaponized other government officials, local government officials, to go after anybody who is breaking the law. And they are not playing around.
Kellie, I like the Black Friday comparison. It's also kind of like, remember that moment in the early weeks of COVID when everybody was rushing to get toilet paper?
Yes.
And it's like, what if they had just said, we are not making any toilet paper after this. So whatever you get your hands on, that's it. And that's basically how people were when it came to booze.
I mean, people were kind of like that with booze during COVID, too.
They were.
These scenes are a little reminiscent. But yeah, so, you know, Interior Secretary Franklin Lane, he wrote in a letter on January 19th, the whole world is skewgy, awry, distorted, and altogether perverse. All goes merry as a dance in hell. And I mean, some of the scenes were kind of wild, people going a little crazy as the clock started to strike, which, you know, I suppose maybe provided proof to those who were in favor of prohibition and the sins of alcohol to be like, look, this is how the people behave. This is why we have been fighting for centuries to clamp down on this vice.
I mean, the New York Herald called it the fifth horse of the apocalypse. Like,
amazing.
Not too hyperbolic, but I mean, like, people really did see this as the end of an era. And I don't think people were fully prepared for how things were going to play out, especially in terms of enforcement, you know, because I think if you think that this is going to be lax or if you think they're cracking skulls, you know, it's going to have a huge impact on the way that you sort of interact with the law.
Yeah, and we're going to do a sort of deep dive into the enforcement and then the evasion of enforcement in part 2 of this two-parter. But I do want to kind of take half a step back and then a big step back and look at one, like what is the larger political, social context of this era in American history? And then I think really fascinating, the like decades and I said, centuries long road to Prohibition as a sort of culmination of a really long movement. But, obviously the 1920s, a reform era, it's really important to think of Prohibition as one in a kind of number of other progressive era reforms. What else is going on that we need to have in mind as we try and understand this moment before we then talk about the deeper history?
It really is a confluence of all of these different streams of American history coming together in this one moment. Like you said, Jody, there's the progressive reforms, which, some of these reforms were things like minimum wage and safer work conditions, but a lot of them were about vice regulation, that you could use the government to sort of ban all the bad things that made society worse. And so alcohol was part of that. World War I plays a big role in it as well because there's a big strand of nativism that runs through Prohibition, this idea that it's actually those awful immigrants who are bringing all of this alcohol and alcohol culture to the United States. And in World War I, the U.S. is fighting against the Germans. Yeah. And they're purveyors of beer. And so World War I leads to that, as well as like a stronger government that can crack down on what people do in ways that they weren't usually able to outside of wartime. And I think another big factor in this is the growth of cities in the United States. When you suddenly have so many people packed into one place, vices that could be seen as private and the matter like held within a family suddenly become a public problem, right? Suddenly you have people packing into saloons, and when they're drunk, they don't just go home, right? They go out into the streets. And reformers really believed that alcohol was kind of the root of all evil. So that once you had drunkenness, then you had fights in the streets, you had more prostitution, you had filth, you had all of these other problems that were associated with drinking. And so all of those come together to make Prohibition possible.
I mean, if you make a list of like defining fault lines in American history, they're all kind of reflected in this story, right? That you said urban versus rural, native versus foreign-born. There's obviously a Catholic versus Protestant thing going on here. There's a racial dimension to all of this. So, we will tease all that stuff out as we go. But let's go from the 1920s back, 100 years, more than 100 years, and just sort of like, temperance does seem to be kind of part of this country's DNA basically from the jump.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, when we think about like the colonial period, I would say, and even throughout history, like access to clean drinking water and the ability to have alternatives for hydration, like alcohol was a big part of people's diet. It was a big part of how they consumed liquid, be it wine or beer or whiskey. I mean, even when you think about the American Revolution and the taxes on whiskey, like it's a big part of American culture. So it's difficult to sort of separate out the two when people see it as so much a part of their diet.
It's a big part of preserving crops as well, right? This is a way that you could take things like corn and barley and grapes and things and give them a much longer life by turning them into these things. And so they're economically important. But people also realize like drunkenness was a problem. Benjamin Rush, who was a famous doctor in the Revolutionary period, talked about how drunkenness was a disease. There were calls for moderation. And then when you get in like the 1820s and 1830s, and there's a massive sort of religious uprising, it's in that moment of religious ferment and fervor that you begin to get all of these people moving into social movements. More organized abolitionist movement, the beginnings of women's suffrage, and also the beginnings of temperance, because people believed that if you could change kind of the moral actions of people, you could build a better society, and maybe you could use government to do that. So it's really in those moments that you get things like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which is one of the big prohibition organizations of its time. It uses the word temperance because they weren't always calling for an outright ban, but they just wanted to like create a culture where people drank a lot less.
Yeah. It's interesting. I forgot that like when you think about especially the slave trade, a lot of what's being traded also is like rum and whiskey. And so people have also connected like those distilleries and that production and that sort of sector of economic growth alongside slavery. Like it's a big part of the slave trade and how people are even purchasing enslaved people with bottles of rum or whiskey or what have you. And so it's a huge industry in New England for sure. You could say, okay, there's not a lot of slavery, but there's a ton of distilleries and that's fueling the slave trade as well.
I've never fully been able to get my head around this kind of central question I always have when I look at the history of alcohol in this country, of whether the stuff was more potent back in the day or less potent, you know? And I think like there was definitely like moonshine and like hard liquor, you know, for forever. But I do think like when we talk about like George Washington drank a ton, or we've done episodes about the Revolutionary War era where they do the like 17 different toasts over the course of a dinner. I think they are drinking pretty weak alcohol. And I think, Kellie, to your point, like a lot of times alcohol was seen as like a safer alternative sometimes to water. But so I don't know. But there were also like people who were definitely like very drunk all the time.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think like more people were a little drunk, but maybe the like really hard alcohol wasn't as potent as maybe it started to become. And maybe the fact that alcohol was getting more potent was part of the sort of push towards prohibition as well.
Yeah, you always have a few bad apples that ruin it for the bunch. A few drunks that ruin it for everyone.
And there was enough of a like organized movement against it that at least at the state level by, you know, the post-Civil War period, you do start to get states regulating and localities regulating against alcohol. So the idea that you could ban alcohol or at least put some constraints on it, that was there even before Prohibition comes around.
Yeah. And definitely like if we're talking about the kind of post-Civil War era and the 50 years, 60 years leading up to the 18th Amendment, it really is also the case that a lot of the racial and cultural fault lines start to be reflected in this fight. And, you know, at some basic level, it was like German immigrants were opening beer halls. And so the sort of culture of drinking around that was seen, be used as a wedge. But like all those fault lines we discussed earlier really start to come into focus as this movement picks up steam.
Yeah. I would even say not just Germans, but also the Irish, you know, when you think about this religious divide and when you think about like the Holy Sacred Sacrament of Communion, you know, that's done with wine. And so the idea of like curtailing someone's religious sacraments are a big part of that as well too.
And so when we're talking about the big surge in prohibition that starts around the 1880s and 1890s, it is not a coincidence that coincides with a surge in immigration to the United States, a surge in the growth of cities in the United States. Like all of these things begin to come together and become sort of part of the coalition that is going to be against alcohol, right? The Prohibition Coalition is going to turn into this massive coalition that includes like nativist, but also religious reformers and like women reformers who are trying to modernize society. But this big eclectic group of people who come together around this issue.
Yeah. There's one little interesting census data point from like the 1860s or 70s that are from after the Civil War, where the vast majority of the 300,000 saloons in the U.S. were owned by first-generation Americans. And I guess, you know, there were many more first-generation Americans back then than there are now, just because it's a newer country. But still, I think it's really important to point out how much the saloon and alcohol, the culture around alcohol, was started to feel like it was aligned with these central questions of kind of what is American, or how are new people assimilating. You know, saloons were where people were gathering to share political ideas. And so it just was this like perfect space for all of these central questions about like, what is this country set to be?
And even, you know, I think about the fact that like a lot of the prohibitionists, I should say, were also African-American, like prominent African-Americans. And I would not have thought that Black people would have been big on prohibition. But if you think about the moment, sort of the turn of the century, it makes a lot of sense when you have people like Sojourner Truth or Booker T. Washington or Ida B. Wells or Frederick Douglass, Du Bois. They're also pushing an agenda, not just for like full Black citizenship, but acceptance that I think goes alongside like respectability politics. And so the idea of drunkenness does not play well into how they want Black people to be perceived. And so there's a lot of like how you get acceptance into American society, and drunkenness ain't it. So people are pushing those ideas along respectability politics too.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the variety of these reform movements, as we were talking about earlier, like abolition and temperance marched side by side for a while. Yeah. This idea that alcohol was being used to sort of repress the working class or to repress Black people in the South, right? This idea that there was a kind of a problem with alcohol that was preventing people from reaching these larger social and political goals. It was possible to make a case, but then it creates these really odd alliances because, as we'll talk about, like the people who are supporting Prohibition are Black reformers and the Ku Klux Klan,
which never go hand in hand. It's like, what?
It doesn't go well.
Yeah. There's strange alliances, and I want to get to some of these characters for sure. But I don't know, Kellie, your point about the respectability politics is taken, but I also think, Niki, are you kind of saying that like? It seems to me like if you can build political ties and allegiances and flex that political networking muscle around, say, temperance, maybe then some of those ties will port over towards abolition. There's just different political spaces in which you're creating, and it's just like there's a sort of flourishing of people operating in political spaces and moving between all of these issues that are flowing together. And so I wonder if, for Black activists, there was even just a sort of strategy of like, well, I'm not going to find an ally if I just start talking to them about abolition, but I can go to meetings about these other issues and start to build coalitions.
Yeah.
I really do believe that political coalitions form this way, right? We talk a lot about single issue politics, and single issue politics are absolutely a point of coalition building, and they bring different groups into politics who may not have been politically active before, but really smart reform movements or really smart political movements broadly, they then attach those really potent single issues to a whole suite of other political policies into a political program. So when a person enters through that narrow door, they then find themselves sort of oriented toward a whole set of related politics.
Yeah. Yeah. And along those lines, it does make sense that the Ku Klux Klan would actually have a prohibitionist stance if you think about the fact that they are anti-immigrant, if you think about the fact that they are anti-Catholic, if you think about the fact that they are also trying to push their own agenda of what American citizenship, white American citizenship should look like. It makes sense that they would be in support of something like prohibition. They want these sort of like fundamentalist ideas around Christianity to proliferate, and that's one of those tenets.
So we should start to introduce some of the people who are part of this movement. And the funny thing about Prohibition is it's often presented as like a woman's movement, right? That there are these women reformers who are going around handing out handbills and pamphlets,
like those long black dresses and heavy coats and hats.
Speaking of respectability politics. And then there are some men who like bring sort of the policy teeth to it. But then you encounter somebody like Carrie Nation, who is there to rebut all of those arguments. She is 6 feet tall, built like a brick house. She is also somebody who thinks that the best form of persuasion is a hatchet, which it does have the benefit of motivating people. She's from Kansas, and she goes through to these different saloons and she just starts destroying them. She'll like run in with her hatchet. She'll say, "Men, I have come to save you from a drunkard's fate," and then start smashing bottles and opening kegs. And
there's a lot of hatchets throughout this story. Listeners should just prepare themselves.
Yeah, I know.
It's a hatchet heavy politics
for sure.
And because in Kansas there was a constitutional amendment that banned liquors, she was like, well, the police can't arrest me for smashing up the saloon because the saloon shouldn't exist in the first place. So, I mean, we'll talk about how that space between the law and practice creates room for a lot of violence when it comes to prohibition. But this was true pretty early on with Nation, she would also sing and pray and do those kinds of things. But she was wielding a hatchet. She called her attacks hatchetations. Yes, agitations, maybe?
Hatchetations. like, obviously at the time, she was seen as an outsized character, and there's a sort of like wild-eyed, crazy version of her story that I think has lingered throughout the years. But I think there's been some really interesting kind of like reframing of her as like a genuine impassioned activist and even a feminist, and someone who kind of was using her agency in the way that she could at that time. But yeah, a lot of times I think when you read about her, hear about her, it's like this crazy woman who was running around, breaking up bars and stuff.
Unhinged with a hatchet.
It's a tough combination. But I think that she like purposely cultivated that image too.
No,
It was like a media savvy move. Her newsletter, because even in the days before Substack, everybody had a newsletter. She was publishing the Smasher's Mail. Her newspaper was called The Hatchet. Like she knew what she was doing. She called herself a bulldog running along at the feet of Jesus, barking at what he doesn't like.
Oh my God. This just kills me. I mean, she is relentless. She's arrested over 30 times. I mean, so even though it's hard to enforce what she's doing, she's still held accountable in some ways, but she's undeterred. I mean, she continues on this mission to create a dry country.
So if that's kind of an activist at one end of the spectrum, rabble-rousing and wielding a hatchet, maybe at the other end of the spectrum is this guy Wayne Wheeler, who is, I think, embodies the kind of very concerted, very legalistic, very moralistic approach and strain to this movement. He's from Ohio. I think by all accounts, he kind of had a real religious awakening in the 1890s, as did a lot of other people. That's a huge part of this story. And he is the one, I think, who is kind of really turns to the sort of hard nuts and bolts politics of this movement. And he's the one who founds things like the Anti-Saloon League, which then has chapters around the country. He starts to work electoral politics. Wheeler is often credited with coining the term pressure group, right? I mean, this is where a lot of these kind of tactics come into play. So, very quickly, or maybe, I was going to say like it transitions from this kind of religious, social-driven movement to the sort of electoral hard-edge politics. But I think maybe the story is it's just all of these things are happening at the same time, right? There's many fronts of this battle.
Yeah, and it's very easy for this to become politicized as well. I mean, I think what Kerry is doing with the hatchet, Wheeler is sort of doing with politics. I mean, he has the ability to push out, the governor of Ohio. I mean, he is taking his group and really coming after anybody that he sees in opposition of prohibition. And he's doing it with great effect. And I think that's where people become a little shook up. It's one thing to sort of close down these saloons here and there. It's another thing to use politics to shape policy in terms of how this plays out.
And I think, Jody, what you said about coining pressure groups, he was doing something different. It wasn't a partisan campaign. He was focused on both parties at a time of pretty high partisanship in the country. And he believed that, okay, I have this group of this part of the electorate that's maybe like 10 to 15%. Not enough for a party, not enough to win an election outright, but enough in a close election, and there are a lot of close elections in the 1900s and 19-teens, enough in a close election to make a difference. So Kellie mentioned that he helps to organize the ouster of the governor of Ohio. That's really the first time they've really flexed their muscle. And then in elections, local elections going forward in the 19-teens, time and time again, the so-called dries, the people who want to put in place prohibition, are the margin of victory for a lot of politicians. And so they use these tactics of like campaign endorsements and financing opponents and blackmailing their political opponents into supporting their cause. And it works pretty well.
That's a really important point about that kind of where is the tipping point and the wedge point, and you can find a lot of political purchase in there. And that also, there's a very savvy media strategy behind that too, and this is, I think, has come to be known as Wheelerism, but it is the kind of idea that he sort of brought into the process where like he had this 10-15%, but through the media, he was able to make that feel like a much, much bigger force than actually maybe it was, because of its outsized impact and because it sat right there on the kind of tipping point of close elections. But there's very much a media story here, too, where the general public sort of spinning this tale that the general public really is in on prohibition. And as we kind of tell the story about how the amendment actually passed, I think this is a really important thing to keep in mind, because I think like time and time again in the march from like up to 1916 to 1920, I think people get surprised, and caught off guard, like, oh, wait a minute, this is really happening? This is really happening? And it's because a little bit they had sort of like been deluded themselves into thinking like, well, I may not want this, but it seems like everyone else wants it, so I guess it'll happen. And then before you know it, it actually happens. And I think that's kind of Wheelerism in action. So let's turn to kind of how we get the march towards the 18th Amendment. And I will point out that one little like overlooked element to this, to the passage of the 18th Amendment, is the passage of the 16th Amendment. And so the 16th Amendment, which is passed in 1913, is what implements a federal income tax, but that replaces a federal alcohol tax. And so it basically just takes alcohol kind of to the back seat of playing a really critical function in the federal government. And I think that just sets the stage. It sort of like, creates a little crack and an instability, and really sets the stage then over the next 3 years for this movement to really, pass this amendment.
Yeah, you think about it as like a necessary condition for prohibition to pass, because that was always going to be a huge roadblock. Because if that's what the federal government is funded on,
I know, I was gonna say.
Alcohol tax,
taking away your base.
So you do have the passage of that amendment, and then you have just a sea change that's happening. So in 1916, neither party takes a position on prohibition, but because of all of that, like state and local level work that Wheeler has been doing, suddenly dries outnumber wets in Congress like 2-1 in both parties. And that actually does set the stage for a prohibition amendment, because it's really hard to pass an amendment to the Constitution. But 2-1, those are the kinds of numbers you need for a constitutional amendment. And so things are in the works pretty quickly after the 1916 election.
Yeah, matters get even worse when war begins, and you have all of this, as you mentioned before, Niki, like anti-German sentiment. I feel like you could make the argument that it felt somewhat un-American to be fighting in a war and trying to pursue like alcohol at the same time. Like there was a clear sort of like agenda about how people felt about prohibition and the war, and you kind of had to tether those things together in order to get buy-in.
And you had an excuse too, right, Kellie? Like there were all of these new rations that were put in place, or not, they didn't quite have rations at the time, but like new ways of the government commanding the economy. So they could tell factories to create something different, or put in place quotas, or put in place limits on sales, or redirect like where grain went. Like grain should go to the war effort. It shouldn't go to making whiskey or making beer. And that actually led to passage of legislation in Congress that you wouldn't, I don't think, have seen in non-war time, where they're like, okay, you can't have beer that's more than 2.75% alcohol. It's pretty low alcohol beer. And then a year later, they pass an even lower limit. So then it's down to like 1.8%. And now you're getting, we're starting to get into nearly non-intoxicating
Yeah, you're getting
beer.
juice. That's juice.
Happy juice.
Give Moscato at that point.
So now we're kind of going 1917 to 1918 to 1919, 1920, but like we're starting to really get some push towards the actual, what would become the 18th Amendment. And it's basically like a year that they have to spend to kind of like wrangle all of the support for the amendment itself. And then, as I said, the amendment passes, and it's another year before they then implement the enforcement of it, which is all to say that this process is pretty fast, and you can kind of tell by the way the 18th Amendment is actually written. It's pretty okay, so basically it forbids 3 things involving, quote, intoxicating liquors. It forbids the manufacture, sale, and transportation. But it does not say what counts as intoxicating. It doesn't really say how enforcement should work. It doesn't really even say that drinking alcohol is illegal, right? The manufacture, sale, and transportation is, but not the actual consumption. And there's like no thought about like exemptions and so forth. So it's just kind of, I don't know, it's like a political document, not a legal document, right? Which I know the Constitution often is. And like, lo and behold, people then start to fight about what the meaning of a constitutional amendment is.
Yeah. Yeah, really.
Yeah, and rightfully so. I mean, part of the reason you saw that mad rush that Kellie described at the beginning of the episode is they didn't make drinking alcohol illegal.
Yeah.
Like you could still do it. And so the alcohol you had in your possession at the time the Prohibition started, you could still drink.
Yeah.
And so that leads to a kind of rush. And it also means that it requires enacting legislation. There has to be some kind of legislation that describes all of those things you're talking about, Jody, because people have to know. You could say that alcohol is illegal, but people have to know the enforcement structures. They have to know like what counts as alcohol, and that's what the Volstead Act, which we'll talk about, is.
Yeah, so we'll sort of really dig into the Volstead Act and its enforcement in next episode. But just to give you a taste, I mean, it runs 17 single-spaced pages. It tries to provide some specifics to this. It defines intoxicating liquors as any beverage over 0.5% alcohol. Obviously, the manufacture, sale, and transport of these beverages. We'll really get into this. It kind of designates enforcement of this with the IRS, which is an interesting choice. It doesn't, again, prohibit the drinking of alcohol. It doesn't prohibit alcohol that you possessed pre-prohibition. And there are all sorts of exceptions. Exceptions, a gentle word for
like
loopholes.
Medicinal liquor.
Medicinal alcohol. People were making a lot of air quotes in 1920 in the same way that Kellie is making air quotes right now. But yes, for instance, personal stockpiles, medicinal alcohol, religious and sacramental wine, homemade cider and wine, and even alcohol that was being used for industrial purposes there were all kind of loopholes around there. And so, yes, we will get into the wild and woolly ways in which those loopholes were exploited next episode. As we wrap up here, though, I do want to kind of read something from the cocktail historian David Wondrich, which, great title, great name, cocktail historian David Wondrich. But he wrote about the passage of the 18th Amendment. He said, "Nobody believed it would happen. Prohibition was a small-town, rural movement, and people in the cities resented it. They really thought up until the very end that there was going to be a way out. And then, suddenly, it became clear that there wasn't." And I will just say that so much of this country's history is about social and political movements that feel that way to people. Oh, we just thought it was this small regional thing. And now, whoa, here it is. But, yeah.
The rural divisions are going to be a theme of the 20th and 21st century. You hear about them today, you hear about them then. And in the 1920s, these are the kind of culture wars of the decade. And we'll talk about that more in the next episode. But there really is a regional and rural-urban divide that is shaping Prohibition.
Yeah. I think you could make the claim it's the first culture war, but we'll get into that.
Yeah, maybe. And war is the right word because it gets pretty violent and pretty crazy.
There are machine guns.
There are tanks. But we've circled back now to where we started that night of January 16th, 1920, that scene that Kellie described of people running around and hiding and drinking as much booze as possible. And next episode, we will look at whatever counts as the new normal as this country settles into Prohibition. And it is, to put it mildly, not normal. There are speakeasies, bootleggers, corrupt enforcement, all sorts of unintended consequences, not to mention all sorts of legal battles that would eventually overturn this amendment. Basically, America is about to wake up on somebody's couch on January 17th, 1920, and be like, wait a minute, what did I get up to last night? Oh my God. Anyway, that is all next episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Hello and welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. Today, part 2 at our look at the first week of Prohibition, the chaos, the corruption, the very American mix of culture and religion and politics. It's kind of basically a cultural hangover. The last episode, we talked about all of the social forces that led up to the 18th Amendment and got us right up until the amendment passed and then the Volstead Act went into effect. Now let's look at the new normal of how it actually played out. It was very not normal, but boy, does it reveal a lot about how this country of ours is wired. Here, as always, to discuss, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So, obviously, listeners can know there are a lot of forces at play here, but since we are talking about a kind of new law here, let's focus on the two sides of that coin, which is law enforcement and then the people breaking the law. And I want to paint the picture first of how they try to enforce this thing, and then we can talk about all the folks who were very creatively trying to avoid the law. But, as we said last time, it was kind of like a law without a roadmap, right? Like the 18th Amendment said, we're going to ban all these things. We're going to ban the consumption and sale and transportation of alcohol, but doesn't really give any details about how you actually enforce that. So Congress rushes through this 17-page, single-space typed Volstead Act, which lays out some of the thresholds for what counts as alcohol, has all sorts of loopholes about medicinal alcohol and so forth, and also hands enforcement to the IRS, which is an agency that was built to tax alcohol, but not necessarily built to eliminate it. And I guess my question there is, was it handed to the IRS because, we mentioned earlier how not much earlier than this, they had passed the 16th Amendment, which kind of shifted the tax base in this country from alcohol to the income tax. But do you think that it was just kind of muscle memory to say, like, okay, if we're enforcing alcohol, that should be a sort of go to the tax agency?
I think so, because I think that it's the IRS that knows where all of the saloons are, right? They have the infrastructure for taxing alcohol, so they have the information that you need in order to police it. They don't have the guns, so they're going to have to build some of those things out.
Yeah.
So the IRS, though, nevertheless still has to scramble because they're not just looking at paperwork and pulling in taxes here. They are enforcing this law and going out into the streets. So they very quickly basically have to scare up what is known as the Prohibition Unit. The people who are in the Prohibition Unit are known as Prohis, and we'll meet some of them in a minute. But they get about 1,500 people basically overnight. They are not very well trained. They actually scrap the requirement that they take a civil service exam. I mean, it's basically just like, get in here, let's go, let's do this.
Honestly, they're doing that with Border Patrol and ICE right now.
I was just about to say
Precisely.
same thing. You need a job, we got a job for you.
Yeah. And, Congress is packing this with their cronies. Like, it's just immediately this vacuum for, at best, just chaos, and at worst, and more realistically, like, tons of corruption and bribes. People are issuing bogus permits or just turning a blind eye. And, all of those obviously like racial, cultural, rural, urban fault lines are starting to manifest themselves, basically right away in terms of the enforcement here. Some of the images from, the early days of enforcement or the days leading up are pretty incredible. I mean, we mentioned tanks last episode, but I mean, there are photos of like decommissioned World War I tanks coming over and like driving over barrels of alcohol and people, smashing up saloons and just basically kind of like running wild. I mean, we talked about some of the non-law enforcement folks who were running wild last episode, but now it's the Prohis who are kind of going ham a little bit.
It just seems so extreme. I mean, in the same way that you would see like book burnings or like, I don't know, when people like don't like a song and then they like destroy all their CDs or something like that. It just, the optics of having a tank run over these distilleries or supplies that are needed to make it, one, is extremely performative but and unnecessary, but also like the federal government is sending the message that if this is what we will do to like the objects of alcohol, imagine what we will do to the people. Like, it is a scare tactic that is meant to show how much they're going to crack down. And that becomes immediate right away.
Yeah.
It also has strong bring the war home vibes. Like when the military power of the state increases, it doesn't stay abroad. Right, it comes home, and that's true as early as World War I. Right, that now the tanks that were used, the machine guns that were used, and also the boats that were used are now used to crack down on Americans who were involved in alcohol sales, alcohol consumption. The Coast Guard really comes to its own during this period because they use speedboats and military ships in order to run down all of these rum runners, liquor smugglers who are using the Great Lakes particularly. Like that's a big area where you're trying to get alcohol from Canada into the United States, and the Coast Guard is there to push you aside.
Yeah, I was recently out on Long Island in east of New York, and someone was telling me about a couple speakeasies in sort of central Long Island or eastern Long Island that were there from when rum runners would come down the coast from Canada and they would land and then they would come through there, and that's where they would stash the alcohol that would then eventually go on trucks into Manhattan. But, it's sort of similar to the cocaine trade in Miami. It's like speedboat technology, such as it was in the 1920s, benefited considerably from all of these kind of game of cat and mouse on the waters.
Yeah.
You want to meet some of the more notable prohies, as they came to be called?
Yeah.
So, look, I think clearly there were people out there who were, excited about the chance to crack some skulls and, go out there and go wild and so forth. There were also a lot of people who were just like understaffed, undermanned, outmatched, just trying to make the most of enforcing a new law. And some of them got to be pretty creative and some of them got to be pretty famous. And so there were one particular couple, early Prohi stars, were Isidore Izzy Einstein and Mo Smith, who came to be known as Izzy and Mo. And they were in New York City. And they really took their job to a new level. Izzy was a kind of like 5'5" Austrian Jewish immigrant, very portly, former postal worker. He spoke all sorts of different languages, and he really became like a master of disguises. And so they would run around and wearing disguises and work their way into saloons and work their way into these networks, and then eventually, put people under arrest. And he was like, one of his catchphrases was like in the middle of a conversation after he'd worked the network, he'd be like, "There's sad news here. I'm sorry to say you're under arrest." And they became kind of like media stars, and they were accounted for 4,932 arrests in the early years of Prohibition, and they achieved a 95% conviction rate, which,
not bad.
What it means, but yeah.
I mean, in a lot of ways, they're entrapping people. They're setting them up. They're saying winning their trust and, hey, can I get a beer? And then as soon as they're like delivered service, it's like, gotcha. It's they're even going as far as to, well, I don't know, it's considered going as far then because it was kind of common, but they would like put on blackface, and go into Harlem or into African American communities trying to win people's trust just to dupe them and then arrest them. Which I kind of feel like if I saw somebody in blackface, I'm gonna be like, what are you doing? That's not something you could, I think, pull off effectively as legit. But yeah, that's what they were doing.
But this does speak to the media environment of it, because they become actually so famous that there's real blowback within the Prohibition unit, and their partnership is dissolved because it's calling too much attention to their work. Einstein writes a #1 best-selling book, sells 1 million copies. There's a comedy about them, and there are other agents who become popular in the press. That's just kind of like the celebrity environment of the time turns these people into household names or characters that people can follow their exploits in the newspapers and the tabloids.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we've done episodes sort of about the period sort of flowing out of this, where the birth of the FBI and how much that was related to a kind of larger media narrative and the sort of cult figure of the enforcement agent. Not to mention, your point is taken, Kellie, that a lot of the tactics of infiltration and entrapment were developed during this era as well. So the one other thing I want to talk about with the sort of whole enforcement mechanism around the Volstead Act, before we then talk about kind of the evasion mechanisms, but we're painting a picture here of chaos, some agents doing in it for the right reasons, a lot of agents doing it for the wrong reasons. Certainly as things grind on, a lot of people taking bribes and a lot of people sort of just kind of compromise in all sorts of ways. It is no surprise then that the court system is completely outmatched, and they're basically getting fed just junk cases one after another. And so, that's a huge part of this story. And I think eventually part of the sort of pressure that leads to the reversal of all of this, but is that the courts and jails basically collapse under the number of caseloads. Jails are overflowed. New York City, which is the heart of so much of this, the NYPD is really upset about the fact that they're getting drafted into federal work. Judges are being compromised and sort of complaining about a system that they just don't believe in anymore and they don't feel can succeed. I think a lot of this sounds maybe familiar, but so many stories, it's when it hits the courts, all of a sudden so many things just come into sharper relief.
There's another thing that I would draw out about this as well, and that is, we've talked a little bit about the sort of excessive use of force, some of the corruption, but also I think the government loses the plot halfway through Prohibition. They decide to poison alcohol in order to prevent bootleggers from using it. And
that's
they
insane.
end up killing like 10,000 people.
Yeah. That's insane. That's insane. I don't understand how you could be like, you know what we're going to do? We're just going to poison it and then that'll teach them. Like, what? What? I mean, of course it just, they have to put a kibosh on that. But like, it just doesn't make sense that you would think that was a practical alternative for getting people to stop drinking. It makes no sense.
I mean, it's a mania,
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, let's turn to the flip side of that coin. So this is a little bit of the enforcement side. I would say the evasion side has even more kind of hijinks and madcap behavior. So where do we want to start with that?
So one of the things about the Volstead Act is that it had a lot of exemptions. So we had mentioned this briefly before, that you were allowed to keep and drink alcohol that you had in your possession if you got it before January 16th. So the crazy thing about it is that people could just stockpile, and they did, to the hilt. And you can't really say necessarily like, oh yeah, I got this before. This is old, but that's how people were sort of getting around this, was stockpiling and then basically using their inventories to say that, they were, they had access to this beforehand. And it's kind of crazy, especially when you think about the fact that, like, not only are regular people doing this, but President Woodrow Wilson was known to have stockpiled his own supply of alcoholic beverages in the White House. And even Warren Harding also has his own large supply in the White House. So nobody
Am I making this up? Or are there like photos of Wilson with like a wheelbarrow of booze, like rapidly moving it into, or was that in some movie or something? I don't know. Maybe I'm just inventing that.
My only hesitation with that is that this would have all happened after, wouldn't this have happened after his stroke?
Yeah, that's true.
So
maybe not. Maybe getting aides to do it.
Yeah.
But I will say, like, presidents, yeah, certainly. But also there's a real like income elite society divide here. I mean, who has the resources to stockpile a ton of existing alcohol and to buy it in ahead? It's the wealthy. And I mean, there's some remarkable stories.
Yeah, I mean, the Yale Club in New York City had enough space and enough money to stockpile enough liquor to continue to serve their patrons for the entire 14 years of Prohibition. A working class person in New York City is not going to have access to what you need in order to make that happen. So there was a real sense of like, even though they're not technically breaking the law when they're drinking, it's like rich people get to do this and poor people don't get to do it.
Yeah. A poor person is like, I got one bottle a year. We're gonna like savor this on some holiday or something like that, and that's about it.
Or I'm drinking moonshine that's going to blind me.
Totally.
Because that's the other, like, there are other ways to sidestep this. Like, you were allowed to preserve fruit through fermentation. So you get all of this, like, rise of hard cider and homemade wines. And so there are these carve-outs. And then there's a black market as well that allows people who weren't able to stockpile to continue to have their intoxicating drinks.
And this is where I think you get, when I lived in Tennessee, you would buy these bottles of, these little jars of moonshine, sometimes from, locals, not off of a shelf in a proper store. They'd have like 4 cherries in the bottom. And I think that was probably a legacy of the fact that you could claim, oh no, what I'm doing is I'm fermenting my fruit, even though it's 97% alcohol.
Now, even though it will strip the skin off of you if it touches you.
It's a little cocktail.
God, I remember eating one of those cherries once and basically like going like effectively blind for 20 minutes.
And that is the downside, right? Like an unregulated industry is unregulated. And so like in addition to the government trying to poison you, like, it's a more dangerous product. Yeah. The other carve out, which we mentioned, is medicinal liquor that doctors could just write you a prescription. And folks know about this. About medicinal pot.
Yeah, same thing.
And that people who smoke pot medicinally, here come the air quotes again, are smoking pot medicinally.
Yeah, because I've got a headache. I've got an ear infection and I need this pot. I like a backache and I need this alcohol. Yeah, it's you could come up with anything.
When Winston Churchill would come to the United States, he would bring a doctor's note for like a bottle of whiskey a day. He would drink it all.
I mean, Old Granddad and Johnny Walker started as medicinal brands in this era. would you trust a doctor named Old Granddad?
I would only trust a doctor named Old Granddad.
When you think about the fact, okay, this is just 6 months into Prohibition, over 15,000 doctors and 57,000 pharmacists are prescribing bootleg alcohol, basically for medicinal purposes. Not only that, but physicians wrote an estimated 11 million prescriptions a year throughout the 1920s. And they did about 40 million in whiskey sales from 1921 to 1930. So, nobody is, or this is an epidemic, but this is a pandemic of epic proportions, the amount of medicinal needs for alcohol.
Honestly, you know how speakeasy bars are kind of a thing now? Mm-hmm. It would be awesome to have just a prescription pad and have somebody write you a prescription for one old fashioned or something like that.
Yeah.
But you could go into, pharmacies and basically order different kinds of alcohol in the same way you could go into a dispensary now and get different strains of weed. But to point out some of the numbers here, in Brooklyn, for instance, a pharmacist would charge you $12 for a pint of whiskey, which is about $150 by today's standards. So, I think there's probably definitely some exploitation going on here.
You don't want to
and
sip
so
that.
Forth. Yeah.
Listen,
exactly.
The key is, will insurance cover it? I don't know.
Obviously, Congress starts to pass some laws to try and curb this, and they sort of ban, for instance, they say maybe beer isn't something you can prescribe, so they kind of ban some laws to tamp down on some of that. New York City's Board of Pharmacy tries to regulate all the different drugstores, but again, it's just a sort of game of whack-a-mole and spotty enforcement, and so it just doesn't. You mentioned the kind of weird moment we are now with the medicinal marijuana industry, but I also, as we described this, frankly, I think about also the opioid epidemic and how a lot of that flowed through these sort of medical systems and then just goes out and has its effect on the populace in a way that's just really hard to regulate or understand.
You have one doctor, he's a Prohibition Commissioner, John F. Kramer, and he is known to have written 475 prescriptions for whiskey in one day. That feels insane. You would have to just that's all you'd be doing all day long, just sign, and giving them out like candy is essentially what you're doing.
And there's so many other ways around this law. You have the religious exemption for wine, which leads to, I think, some pretty great communion wines during the 1920s, because that's where it's going, to synagogues and to Catholic churches. You have states and localities that just refuse to enforce prohibition. They're if the feds want to turn this into a criminal enforcement thing, they can come here and do it, but we are not going to do it. That's not where our resources are going. And so there is just this there's just not public buy-in to prohibition, as popular as it had to have been to become a constitutional amendment. Yeah.
I also wonder how much there is an argument to be made that a lot of the hysteria simply came from the fact that it was illegal. Had there never been any prohibition, would there have been all of this hoopla about, drunkenness and, sure, you always have your standard neighborhood junker. But for the most part, the way that people were abusing this excessively would not have necessarily happened had it been legal the whole time.
I think it would have looked different, right? Yeah. There would still have been drunkenness. Certainly there were millions of people in the United States who would not have tried to procure liquor on the black market, right? So I think that there are these profound changes that happen, but the exactly what you're talking about, Kellie, which we've learned from all different kinds of prohibitions, that when you turn something into a black market, it has all of these knock-on effects, and crime is a big part of it, obviously, because you've just made a bunch of stuff illegal. But also, now when you drink, you're breaking the law, so it puts you into just a different headspace.
Yeah.
But it also shifts the sort of cultural contours of all of this, right? If we were sort of, in the last episode, we came to understand the temperance movement as a real cultural force. Now the kind of evasion of the prohibition has obviously all of its, we're talking about the 1920s here and speakeasies and all that stuff. There's a sort of cultural cachet to getting around all of these laws. Before we kind of really go into that and start to look at how things start to turn and the sort of like just sort of impact of all of this, I do want to take a moment to give a shout out to Dr. Welch's grape juice. So I think I have this right, but basically, yeah, there's laws about the religious use of wine, but recreational wine, so to speak, is outlawed. And so there's all these grapes basically in the country that like don't know what's going to happen, and basically leads to the rise of grape juice as a thing that people drink. But moreover, they start to sell grape juice in stores, and they're like, take this home and don't you dare let it ferment on its own and turn into wine. You better drink this as grape juice. And that basically seems to be like the rise of Dr. Welch's. Is basically this wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We're selling you grape juice and don't let it turn into wine. But that's where that comes from.
They very specifically put on the bottle, they're like, if you do X, Y, or Z, it's going to turn into wine. So don't do those things.
Do those things.
Like explicit instructions on the side of the bottle.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And you're like, thank you, Welch's. Thank you.
Definitely don't wait 6 months and then have this with a little bit of camembert and some,
Oh, wow.
Anyway, okay. So let's come back, I think, a little bit to, in a bigger sense, the impact on all of this and how this kind of affected, we talked a lot about how enforcement was spotty, but also about how this revealed so many of the existing fractures in American civil society at the time. And clearly one of them is that there was a lot of enforcement targeted at the less wealthy. And, the ability to do all these shenanigans and evade all these laws was really a privilege in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the Irish world, there was an article that basically said up until the present, prohibition had been a law for the poor and a joke for the rich. And it went on to say, let it be the law for all, and then we can all laugh. And I do think the class dynamics are real here. Historian Elizabeth Cohen talks about how a rich family could have a cellar full of liquor and get by, but if a poor family had like one bottle of home brew, they could be in deep trouble. And so you see these class dynamics playing out a lot. I mean, you still see it to this day. I mean, with illicit drugs, it's like you could be at some party in Manhattan and, everybody's doing coke or whatever. But, when you see this play out in other areas of the country or in other parts of the city, the consequences are much steeper.
And you see what are now very familiar patterns in policing. So the people who are cracked down on are in poor communities, they're immigrants, they're Black people, and prohibition just becomes the lens through which those communities are cracked down upon and by which those enforcement regimes are empowered. Because you're coming out of the 1920s and 30s with a much bigger federal law enforcement apparatus. The FBI is enormous, grows to an enormous extent during the 1920s, and a more militarized policing presence in a number of U.S. cities, and that's caused by the enforcement of prohibition.
Yeah. So we'll start to wrap up here, but we haven't mentioned Daniel Okrent yet on this show, but he is obviously the, I would say, most popular, revered historian of alcohol and prohibition in this country. And he wrote in his sweeping book about all this, he said, the 18th Amendment, ostensibly addressing the single subject of intoxicating beverages, would set off an avalanche of change in areas as diverse as international trade, speedboat design, tourism practices, and the English language. It would provoke the establishment of the first nationwide criminal syndicate, the idea of home dinner parties, the deep engagement of women in political issues other than suffrage, and the creation of Las Vegas. So we've touched on a number of those. He also didn't point out, we can't let this go by, but the rise of NASCAR, also part of this story, right? Fast cars that need to evade, that moonshine is used to evade law enforcement, eventually leads to NASCAR. But I mean, the ripple effects are, from the mundane all the way up to these huge sweeping societal changes. It's really hard to overstate.
What I'm hearing is that the 18th Amendment gives us cool boats, cool cars, dinner parties, and more women in
vote.
Politics, and Las Vegas. Maybe it wasn't so bad. Maybe I'm pro prohibition.
Oh man! Well, you're pro ripple effects.
Yeah.
Speakeasies and flapper dresses.
I know.
Yeah, and obviously it's the 1920s here. Yeah, we haven't talked about jazz and, the kind of roaring 20s and all of that stuff.
Yeah, are you against cool music, Jody?
No,
I know. Good times.
Music.
These are good times.
And music sounds a lot better when you had one or two. So yes, I guess I will throw this question to you, and let me frame it this way. If we're talking about 50 weeks that shaped America, let's not take on American history right now. But how much do you feel like Prohibition is like kind of the defining force of, say, the second half of the 1920s, which are a clearly very transformative period in this country's history? I mean, you read that quote from McCrint and it feels like, oh gosh, everything feels like it flows from this.
I think it's more than the second half of the 1920s. It's the rest of the 20th century is shaped by Prohibition, both in good ways and bad. I mean, the fact that Prohibition is ultimately repealed discredits a kind of moralistic government intervention. Obviously, there's still going to be so much prohibition in the United States. Prohibition of drugs. You're eventually going to have more regulation on things like tobacco. But there is this sense that government can go too far in this kind of like nanny state sense. And so I think what you get, you obviously see the rapid growth of government over the course of the 20th century. It doesn't discredit the growth of government, but I think it maybe changes the kind of government that we get coming out of the 1920s and 1930s.
No question. I think the entire decade, this 1920 to 1930, has a huge sort of impact on how we understand punishment and policing. And especially when it comes to low income, poor, Black and brown people, you would start to see, I won't necessarily say the origins of the carceral state, because that's it has an origin state much earlier than that. But in the way we start to think of like mass incarceration and policing and crackdown on crime, and the way that we have sort of understood the federal government as this person that is looking out for deviance in a way that makes everyone sort of suspect, becomes a big part of that decade and even going forward. So as much as I think there's some fun, sort of exciting moments that you could pull out of that, I really think that there are huge consequences in terms of how we think about like harm and harm reduction.
Yeah.
I also think like in a big picture kind of way, this is the way that Americans come to grasp more easily the space between law and practice. Like that you actually can't have these big sweeping laws without societal buy-in. It doesn't work. Like if people don't agree with the law, then you're going to get this kind of disobedience, and that disobedience can be really popular. In some ways, it'd be interesting, Kellie, to think about the relationship between this and civil disobedience and the ways that Americans come to have almost a more contentious relationship with the law, even with the rise of law and order, which is a rhetoric that is also growing up alongside this from the 1920s through the 1960s through today. So I think there is something really interesting about law and lawlessness that is being worked out in this decade.
Yeah, or the difference between laws and harm. Like, just because it's the law doesn't necessarily mean it's harmful, and just because it's harmful doesn't necessarily mean it shouldn't be the law. Like, all of those things go back and forth in terms of like, where are our values and what do we want? How do we want our values to become policy?
And of course, the 18th Amendment puts in prohibition. That the next amendment to the Constitution gives women the right to vote. And I think, when we talk about impact of this era, we talked about this, but the way in which the temperance movement, so many temperance activists also then were women's rights activists. I think it just proved to the country that women's political power was legitimate and necessary in many ways. And, and then even actually, as people were fighting to preserve Prohibition, they kind of felt like women's suffrage was one of the keys to that. Ultimately, it doesn't work. They repeal it at the 21st Amendment. But I think obviously that's a huge part of this story as well.
And hey, they're working on repealing the 19th Amendment now, too.
Yeah.
So,
oh, God. Way to bring it down, Niki.
That's my role on this show.
Let me end So throughout this series, we're going to ask big questions and small questions. And I think one of the big questions we're going to ask, and we just kind of talked about it, but at the end of each episode is like, how did this week shape America? And I think you just heard our thoughts on that. Let me run through a couple other like quick hit questions that we'll try and revisit with each of these stories. But I don't know, do you feel like Prohibition is, when people talk about the sweep of U.S. history, is this talked about too much, too little, about the right amount? Is it kind of like get its due?
It is correctly talked about.
Yeah.
Like people know about Prohibition.
Yeah.
They might not understand all of the contours of it, but they know about Prohibition.
Yeah. And I'll say this is one of the few eras that is not misremembered. You know, like I feel like we get it pretty right. We understand that like this was a law that was not favorable and that had a lot of consequences to it. And I think that is the most pervasive memory. I mean, the fact that it's overturned shows us that, but like, I don't see a whole lot of like myths or legends that make Prohibition something difficult to understand or difficult to grasp because there's so much division about whether or not it was good or bad.
Do you think part of that, as historians, do you think part of that is because it's like so seductive a story with all these characters and all this sort of stuff that like people do visit it a lot, right? You get the Daniel Krentz writing book after book. You get a lot of like you get the TV shows and so forth, that it just feels like it's well-mined territory, which means that a lot of the stuff is a lot of the sort of nuance and contours are going to emerge. Whereas we'll talk about it throughout the series, but there's other parts of U.S. history that are a little drier or harder to stomach or whatever, and it's like you just don't get that sort of popular revisiting of it as much.
There are so many movies set in the 1920s. People dress like flappers every year at Halloween, and even for non-Halloween dress up. Like this is people like to remember the 1920s.
I do want to see the Hatchet Nation movie. I do want to see her going at it with a hatchet, trying to like.
Yeah. Well, okay. So this brings us to our next question. So one of our questions on our list that we're going to visit from time to time is like, should this be a movie or TV series? I think we can skip over that one because there have been plenty of movies and TV series. Yeah. I'm actually about to start a rewatch of Boardwalk Empire, which is on my like top 5 or so TV shows of all time, and I'm excited to get back into that. So yes, clearly lots of taken care of. But one of the questions that I'm curious to ask as we go throughout this series is who from this story deserves a statue or a memorial or some other sort of thing? And I think it's pretty obvious. It's the 6-foot-tall woman holding the hatchet, storming into a salon.
Yeah. It's absolutely Carrie Nation. Look, I know we're not supposed to glamorize political violence. Kellie has written 2 really great books on why it's sometimes necessary. Also, hatchets look cool. It'll make a great statue.
Oh, yeah.
And guess what, folks? You can go to Wichita. You can go to Wichita, Kansas, and you can see yourself a bronze statue of Carrie Nation. She's got a Bible in one hand and a hatchet in the other. I think looking at a photo of it right now, I think the hatchet could be a little bigger. A little more intimidating, but you know.
Is it a dagger or
a road trip?
Yeah, actually, I think there's a couple statues, and in all of them, the hatchet is way too small. Maybe historically accurate, but come on, folks, let's play it up.
I want it to look like a woodsman's axe, like an axe. Let's get some heft to it. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode, week 2 of our 50 Weeks That Shaped America, looking at the rise of Prohibition and how it shaped this country. We leave the 1920s now, and coming up next, we're going to go into the 19th century, 1815, the Battle of New Orleans. Then we're going to jump around back to the more recent times and talk about George Bush and the axis of evil, the gold rush, roots, all of that coming up. But that brings us to the end of this episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day is a proud member of Radiotopia, a network of independent, artist-produced podcasts. Don't forget to sign up for our America 250 Watch newsletter. Every Thursday, members get exclusive access to analysis and information about the semi-quincentennial, commentary from our team, and a list of fascinating things that happened that week throughout history. Join in, find out lots more at thisdaypod.com. You can also follow This Day Pod on Instagram, Blue Sky, and YouTube. Jacob Feldman is our researcher. Brittany Brown is our editor. My name is Jody Avirgan. See you soon.